Hey, it's Alex here from Black Sheep IT Consulting. And today we're going down in history back to 2002-ish, when yours truly was a young Siebel instructor and consultant, and Siebel Systems was still an independent company way before the Oracle acquisition. And Siebel Systems was so successful that almost every large corporation organization on the planet used it. And those large organizations also use a lot of other systems, ERP, like SAP, Oracle E-Business Suite, PeopleSoft, you name it. And they ended up integrating those applications, not just Siebel CRM, but any of those applications, and they created this mishmash web of integrations that might look familiar to some of you, and still 20 years after that would still be present in some organizations in this or some other form. But Siebel Systems had the idea to assist customers to get from this to something that looks more like this, so much more organized. And you can see in the middle there's an integration server, and the product was called Universal Application Network, or UAN. Now, I just did a Google search to go back in history. I'm having flashbacks as I record this with all the old images that you can find and articles on the web praising Universal Application Network as one of the first of its kind of standard integrations between business applications. Now, there are lots of images here, probably illicit this one, but it shows the Siebel Business Integration Applications. There was another name for that. So that's the software running on that integration server. The integration server could have been anything really, like TIBCO, BEA, which became Oracle WebLogic later. And there's another slide grabbed from Google here, where you can see the Universal Application Network as the base layer in this architecture, connecting prettily to everything, every large information system that you have, and of course integrating Siebel CRM with those systems. Okay, now you're off to Google yourself and learn some history, and maybe you might remember Universal Application Network. And it's now defunct. It's no longer a product. You might have heard of Oracle Application Integration Architecture, which I think made it into Oracle Cloud. It's not the same product by any means, but it's the same concept. Now here we are looking at an old bookshelf guide. I think that's from 7.5 or 7.7, so around the time when UAN was a product. You find these still on the internet. And this one mentions Universal Application Network together with the actual topic of today's video, ASIs, which are Application Services Interfaces. Now, if you read through this bookshelf guide, there is even an own bookshelf guide for ASIs. So there's a whole guide dedicated to this technology. And this technology was like created in parallel to Universal Application Network. And since UAN was using the best of breed integration protocols back in the day, 20 years ago, so you can see transports like the mighty MQ series, MSMQ, and, wow, would you believe it, HTTP or HTTPS, of course. That stands for Web Services. Here, there it is again, Web Services and WSDL, and that was all the rage, again, 20 years ago. This sounds like a boomer lesson here, but still Siebel today is, a lot of projects are heavily using web services and using those WSDL files, and you can imagine that creating a standard integration between two standard business applications using a standard transport and standard exchange language, aka XML in this case, that was a good idea. It is still a good idea today. So let's say, break down that monolith that always people claim Siebel is into, well, hundreds or even thousands of tiny little services, well, business services, and those business services dedicated to this special type of integration are ASIs. Now, again, I'll send you off to Google a little bit, find those bookshelf guides. I put a link in the description of this video for your reference, so you can read up on this. So that's the birth of ASIs was with Universal Application Network, but ASIs are business services in their own right. And now we're looking at the inbound web services view, standard Siebel view. You can reach it as Siebel Administrator in any application. And that lists all the standard, well, if you're looking at a vanilla database, all the standard web services that can be used inbound in Siebel via SOAP. That is, well, back in the day, that was the protocol of choice. So let's search for a specific one by name. For example, if you want to exchange data related to Siebel accounts, well, there's a web service called Siebel Account. And you might, this one's inactive, but you can activate it and play around with it. And that is a web service definition. So any web service definition behind the scenes, there's the web service inbound dispatcher, and that dispatches to, well, another business service. In that case, the business service has the same name, Siebel Account. And it has quite a lot of operations listed here. And those operations, if you look carefully, they look like, we've seen that before, delete, insert, or update, query by example, query by ID, synchronize, update. Now, this might look very familiar if you're familiar with the EAI Siebel adapter. That's, of course, a very important business service in Siebel integration, and you might have used it already. And that EAI Siebel adapter has very similar methods like query, upsert, and so forth. So let's check out this business service. So off to Siebel Tools or Web Tools we go, and let's choose Business Service, and let's find Siebel Account. Okay. And there it is. Of course, it's a real business service. So it has methods, as you would expect. The methods we have just seen in the inbound web services view. Here they are. Let's take query by ID, and this one should have arguments declared. So it's a very well documented business service. So not all standard business services have all their methods being declared and the method's argument. So this method argument for query by ID, the input is a primary row ID, and the output is, surprisingly, not just a hierarchy, it's an integration object instance. So that actually is something called strong typing. So usually you find in business services, you find the data type to be something like hierarchy, if you work with hierarchical arbitrary property sets. But in this case, it's integration object. So that makes it interesting because it binds another repository object to this business service, or to this method rather, namely account interface. So that's the integration object that is used to exchange the data. So if you look at insert or update, account interface, the integration object instance resulting in a Siebel message when processed, is the input and output. So insert or update, okay, yeah, of course you input something and you get something back, okay, and that looks like this integration object. So that is the structure, the data structure definition. Now, if you know about WSDL files, when you generate a WSDL, let's generate one. So let me press that button. and that yields the WSDL file for that service. Let's open in Notepad real quick. Then you see that not only the endpoint URL and the methods are listed here, but also the data schema. And here it is the name again, account interface. So the whole integration object is described here as XSD, which makes up the largest portion of this WSDL file, is actually the XSD describing the data being exchanged. Now there's your primary row ID for the input of query by ID, etc. So this way an external system can make sense of the service description. That is the service description you're looking at, and know what data to send and what data to expect. So that's the whole point of a WSDL file anyway. But you might be surprised that this integration object makes it into the WSDL file as an XSD, because that is listed as the method argument here. So the process of WSDL generation goes down this track and retrieves the integration object XSD. So in hindsight, you must have either a primitive data type such as string, or a strong type data type such as an integration object definition, so you can generate the XSD for an inbound web service. So you can do, at least in Siebel tools, you can do stuff like this. So let's go to Siebel account in Siebel tools. That functionality has not yet arrived in web tools, but you can right click any business service and deploy as web service. So that's also from these days of, well, having a business service that can exchange data and has a well-defined strong type data structure, integration object reference, and you can deploy this as a web service. Of course, Siebel and Oracle has done this already, so it's already in the database. But imagine you have a custom service and you want to deploy it as a web service for SOAP integration. You would do exactly this, and it will work because you have strong typed or primitive arguments. The same goes with workflows, by the way. So you can also expose workflows as a web service. Now, fast forward 20 years, and we are using the REST API. So I want to be able to do something like this. Here's obviously Siebel message as a JSON that I get from an external system. So let's say I've convinced the external developers or sent them a Swagger or OpenAPI file, so they can generate this JSON. And the JSON lists an integration object. So it's a true Siebel message, and the Siebel message contains a service request in this case, and a list of, to spice things up, attachments with the base 64 representation of the attachment right here. So I want to be able to process this using the REST API using /service. So you can see that is already visible here. That's a custom service name. So we're getting there. Let's jump back to web tools for a moment, and let's say, okay, this is a cool business service. And there in the method arguments, I find the integration object. So I could, when I'm doing this right now, I can find this integration object and inspect it. So, okay, this is account interface. Base object type is a bit weird. It's XML. That's not a Siebel business object here. Okay, let's note that down. And it, well, has a modest collection of integration components. Yeah, like 7, including the primary and some MVG-driven or child business components. So that is what you get. And if you look into the integration component fields, you'll notice that also there's a very modest selection of fields. So just literally as a kickoff point for integration. So it's not like the base integration objects for the REST API, which have everything. This is very limited. And of course, back in 2002, it was all about, well, limiting the amount of data to absolute necessary data. So for account, it's not much difference. You have a few more fields here, but I would be surprised, yeah, if it's more than 40, so it's 38. So very small integration objects these are. But this one, you can't use it with EI Siebel adapter since it's, well, it's it's actually mentioning a business object name, but it's not a integration object for an internal business object. So let's go back to that business service and have a closer look at the business service user properties, where this business service is declared as an ASI. Haha, here, this makes the business service an ASI, not just this user prop, it's also the class. That makes it a data synchronization service, special type of class here. And here is an internal integration object. So imagine an external system sending or wanting to receive data from Siebel. That's what the account interface is for, XML definition. And the internal account interface is used to internally query or insert update Siebel. So that's what the EI Siebel adapter uses to communicate with the internal business components. So let's check it out. So let's do a side-by-side. So we can do something like a query like so, and we should get both. We get a bit more than we want, but here's the internal account interface. And the base object type now is Siebel Business Object. So that's a real internal integration object. And you could compare it with the account interface one, and you would find them to be totally similar. So let's check out the fields for account here. And that is, well, a bit more because there's a lot of inactive ones. So let's query for the non-inactive. And let's see. Yeah, that's 38 again. So here the technique was to deactivate fields, and the external one just has the fields, no inactive ones. So you can imagine if you have a custom field in account, you would have to add this field to the internal one and add the same field to the, well, let's call it external one, right? So two integration objects are required for a real ASI. So if you have two integration objects, what else do you need? Yes, you need a data map. You need to map them using the EI data transformation engine or data mapper. And that's exactly what happens inside the ASI. Data mapper is engaged as part of that special class and maps those integration objects and vice versa. Now you will not find a map actually. So we could try and find one with dependency finder, and there is data maps. Dependency finder, by the way, is a feature in DevPops. So I just use DevPops here. If you don't know what DevPops is, search the YouTube channel for DevPops. And yes, there are some maps which use this internal account interface as the source or destination, but they don't use the account interface. So the account interface, let's find, that's used in zero data maps, all right? So, which means there's no data map declared ever. And how does that, can that be mapped? Yes, because the data mapper has an auto map feature. When the path, that is the integration component name, and the field name is exactly the same, it maps the values automatically. Automap, that's a method. So we have EI Siebel adapter working with the internal integration object. We have the data mapper using automap to map it to the, let's call it external or interface integration object. And that is being used as the endpoint for incoming or outgoing data for the ASI. Okay, that's all very exciting. So you can start using these ASI. And how many are there? So let's query for the class CSS EI Data Sync Service. And whoa, so a lot of inactive ones, but a lot of active ones, various industries, financial services, life cycle, order management, and generic ones like Siebel Contact, Siebel Employee. Most of them already exposed as a web service, marked for external use. So that's kind of a marker from Oracle. It's okay for customers to use that. So yeah, 200. Okay, some inactive ones, but more than 100 probably active, and a lot of them with a usable web service definition, so can be immediately used via web services. And all of them use these integration objects. Of course, different ones. So if you look for CMU product, for example, you'll find similar methods. And for each method, you will find similar arguments, but of course, there's a different integration object definition here used as the interface. And in the user properties, you will find that, yes, it's an ASI and the internal integration object. Now, that can be the same as the external one, and the auto map will still map it. So that's the easy way out. If you don't want two different structures, just have one. And of course, all these integration objects are built on vanilla business objects, so they don't include your custom fields or your custom components, and they don't expose your custom business objects, etc. But now you're getting the idea. Okay, I want, again, back to my use case, I want to be able to insert or update service requests, so create the service requests if it doesn't exist, and in the same way or later as a second update, add one or more attachments using base 64. That's also one of the requirements. Here, the external application sends me base 64. I convinced the external developers in my theoretical scenario here to generate this very JSON. Of course, that requires some work on the external side. They could simply pass in, well, here's a service request number, look it up your Siebel, you know what to do. And here's a base 64, I want this to be an attachment. That would be two separate input properties, but you get the idea. You can write a business service that then pulls together the Siebel message and then sends it to the ASI. So we're just saving a step here. Okay, so you can see that my business service here that I'm using is called BCRM SR ASI. Of course, that's a custom one. So what did I do? That was actually straightforward. So first I created an integration object. Actually only one, because I use it for internal and external. That integration object is called BCRM SRIO, using the wizard, and you notice it's referencing service request, and it includes service request and service request attachment. I added, made sure some fields are available, and they have all keys. So there's, for example, for service request, I'm using the ID and SR number as user keys, and I have a status key as well. So you might be interested what a status key is. A status key is a collection of fields that are returned by EI Siebel Adapter to report on the status. And one field is particularly interesting is operation, which is a system field that EI Siebel Adapter populates. You can see what happened to the record. Was it inserted or updated or deleted? So that status key is also something you might want to use for ASIs because it gives you a lot of information back with just a simple property set to true. So I made sure my integration object is fine. You can test it with EI Siebel adapter, and it works with the attachments in general. Now let's not focus on the attachments, but that's of course also an interesting story here. So I have this integration object, and now I went and I copied one of these business services. So I always choose Siebel account. I copy the record, make sure I have the same class, and thus I create a business service called BCRM SRASI. So same class, different name, of course. And well, now you can decide, do you want to keep all these methods, or maybe delete sounds too dangerous, or synchronize, or you want to add custom methods that wrap other methods? Up to you. I choose to keep all these methods, but of course these are copies from the original. So you have to go into each argument and guess what? Replace the Siebel message integration object reference with your custom integration object. Yeah. So basically you change that integration object name with your real, and I also changed the display name string override, so it's clean, nice and clean. And don't forget the business service user property, where you have the internal integration object. And there again, it's the same integration object, so that works. But you need to declare it here as well. Okay, and voila, you have an ASI using a custom integration object and providing you with a quick and modern interface, not just for SOAP. You can now expose it as a web service, but for REST, you don't need to expose it as a web service, because any business service can be used via REST as long as it's registered with the responsibilities of the users that use the REST API. So you know the drill. So you have to go to Business Service Access, Administration Application, Business Service Access, and create a record for the business service that you want to expose, the responsibilities you want to make it available, and the business service methods you want to expose. So here's another option to filter or disallow only specific methods. Notice I have created a custom method, actually using some eScript, coming to that. But first I have insert or update, and I want to test that. So of course I cleared the caches and all I delivered. So here let's use insert or update, the original method that came from the copy. And a status object true is something you can pass on to actually request the status object, the default being false. And then there's my Siebel message. Yeah, important stuff is of course the name of the integration object, the message type. And let's say I want to create a new SR. I can use the key I created on ID, and empty key doesn't work. EI Siebel adapter does not like this. But if I enter something that definitely is not a row ID, like dummy, it will search for it, will look it up, will not find it, and because insert or update, it will insert that service request, and it will also insert, of course, any attachment, any child record, because it's a new service request, new parent. So that would be, well, I have added some fields just for the fun of it. Okay. I use match request format equals yes, so I don't have to declare a body inside the payload. So that makes it easier to work with those property sets. So now do a post, send it off. And takes a while. Big attachments. There are actually 2 attachments here. And we're back. So notice there's a custom property in the output, which I will explain in a second. But here's the Siebel message. That is actually the result of the status key. So it tells me this service request status is open. This is the real row ID created. This is the operation happened, was inserted. And I got the service request number. Let's copy that. And I also see the 2 attachments have been inserted. So now I should have a service request with those attachments. Let's check it out. So let's just using the service request number. There is the service request, all right. And when I drill down, should have 2 attachments. Okay, so again, that was one business service, one post in the REST API with base64 as the attachments, and voila, works like a charm, and has all the fields I requested, and so forth. So, okay, that works nice. So let's make a mistake. So let's change that a little bit. So now I have an SR number, and I can pass that in as the key. Now I want to do an update. I'm keeping the attachments in my test message. Of course, in real life, you probably don't want that. So let's update the priority to something that doesn't exist, like test. So that's a mistake. That's a should be a pick list error, right? Let's send it off. And well, we get from the REST API, we get this error output. We get a 500 generic error, yeah, which is very hard, and error. So it's not really a property set that is returned. So it has literally hit an exception, and that exception caused the REST dispatcher service to produce this error message. Of course, it has the error message that is the root cause. Does not match any value. The value entered in the field doesn't match any value in the pick list, as expected, so it didn't work. But I'm missing all the information in the format of a property set. So what I did was adding server scripts to my custom ASI. So that server script here is really just educational. You see I put it in pre-invoke method. And so I have my return value, defaults to continue operation. And if the method is my custom method, then cancel operation, because otherwise I get an error, and call a custom function that I created. If the method is insert or update, then copy the first child, that's the Siebel message, hopefully, then grab the SR, which is the next child inside, and the next child, that's like list of SR, the integration object instance, and grab the input ID and write it to output as BCRM input ID. We have seen that a few minutes ago, we have seen that BCRM input ID being reported in the output. So that's an example. I want to enrich that ASI to give me additional information about the processing. What was the input ID? Because in the status object, I get the ID of the resulting record, right? So I want the input ID like dummy. So that custom function is very short. It's called BCRM upsert wrapper. So it wraps the upsert method into a try catch block. So it invokes the insert or update method, passing in the input and output property sets. And in case of any error, it produces an output property set property called BCRM error with the error. So I still have in property set schema to work with as the external application. Of course, you can expand this and say, okay, let's write additional information to the output property set. Let's do another lookup, etc. in maybe invoke method, which is post invoke method, and so forth. Invoke a workflow in between. You get the idea. So now if I call this method, still the same input, it's just a wrapper method, BCRM upsert wrapper, keeping all the same input. I get the BCRM input ID empty because that was not provided, and I get the BCRM error property. So this is a real property set, so it says okay, so it's actually not, no exception happened. Well, it was handled in my catch block, and the catch block added this error property with the error description. So you can imagine translating this for the external application. This really means you should check your values that you submit, etc. Or here, or even better, here's the list of values you can use, right? So that would be a nice response. So you can make a nicer response to the external system. Still, it was okay, but we had an error processing the data. Not sure how you can influence the HTTP status. You can probably throw an exception, but let's not go there. So to summarize, we started our journey 20 years ago with Universal Application Network. We discovered there is a business service class called Application Services Interfaces, and they can be put to really good use in the modern day REST API, either standard business services of that class or custom copies. If you're in the custom copy, anything goes. And you use integration objects, you have the power of EI Siebel adapter, you have data mapper at your disposal. And I hit that in the presentation, you can use base64 input right in the input JSON. Now try that out with any other business service, and you will see that ASIs are really something that you should consider maybe for your next RESTful integration. So happy resting, and thanks for watching. Take care and bye-bye.